disconnect that you're probably feeling in your mind right now, because this is not about search, okay? So I should just preface this by saying I'm not going to do what it says that I'm going to do in that agenda, basically because I broke my search, right? I'm running this in Windows 7, and I had some issues, right? So I won't go into the detail. But I thought a lot about, what would be most useful for building document assembly applications, whether or not you're doing it in SharePoint, because this whole notion of, if you can pull the data from the process of building the document, then theoretically you can pull that data from anywhere, right? You saw that we were just using the SharePoint API to pull stuff from a contact list, getting it from a list or a list that's related to another list. All of that is pretty well known. That has not so much to do with document assembly. When you get to something like what I was going to talk about, which was enabling the document assembly process to have an undefined number of components that then the user engages in a search exercise in order to tell you what components to include, then you have to deal with subdocuments in the document assembly mechanism, right? You have to have some mechanism for stitching those Word documents into your output stream. That's a little bit more advanced. And so I thought about it, and I said, well, you know what? Why don't we just focus on the XPath process, because that's going to be used in any case, okay? This pull mechanism is the thing that's going to really give you the flexibility that you need to build real-world solutions. So, what am I talking about? Okay, this is, the same slide from the previous one, right? Saying that you have to anticipate all these things, all the requirements that you want, but I've added this section for strategy. We want to shift the burden to the rendering application to handle all the styling and layout, similar to a browser, okay, dealing with HTML, right? And we want to create our own custom API to handle all the business logic and data resolution separately. If we can maintain these things separate, right, then we have a better chance of being able to define a flexible API and a more reusable template. So the idea is that just like with the XSLT transform, we want to start with an existing document of arbitrary complexity, right? We want to be able to grab any docx file from anywhere and use it as our template. And then we want to drop in placeholders into that template that have all the information that's needed to go and find the content that is going to be replaced by that placeholder, okay? That's the mechanism we want to use, because then we can shift out that template easily. We can give it to someone who doesn't know anything about coding, and they can give us back the template with the expressions in it, okay? And we're going to leverage the content controls that Word ML, the word processing ML gives us, in order to ensure that our placeholders are not modified so that we can rely on the expression that's in that placeholder, okay? We're going to also take a couple of additional approaches to protect that placeholder, to make sure that the content that's in there is reliable. Because why do we need that? Because the content that we put in that placeholder is not just arbitrary text. It's an expression that we're going to somehow parse to figure out where to get the document, where to get the data, okay? The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that it's not just scalar information. It could be structured information. And we've got some specific structures that we need to be able to handle in order to create real documents, okay? You follow me? Right? It's not just a simple transformation anymore. It's a structured transformation that we've got to be able to deal with. Typically, when we're dealing with real documents, we've got to, first of all, insert individual data field values, whatever they are. But we also have to deal with tables, right? Tables are a challenge, particularly because of the way that tables have been implemented in Word, okay? It's somehow, and if you look at just tables generically, right, it's a simple concept, right? Just rows and columns. But in Word, inside of those cells, you can have rich content, right? You've got paragraphs and runs and images and whatever else is in that cell, and it's not necessarily a uniform table, right? So you've got to actually process the table from top to bottom, reading it in order to figure out what goes where, right? You can't just splat in a table, okay? So this is back to that word ML, right? But again, if we can create an API to do that for us, we don't have to do it but once, and we've got a reliable table generation mechanism, okay? You've also got to deal with repeating sections, similar to tables, but unstructured, not laid out in rows and columns, arbitrary collections of runs, right, that are in a section that are going to be repeated. Let's say you have, just like my chapter, right, where you had sections in the chapter, right, that section is going to be repeated. It's the same basic structure, but with different substitutions in each one, right, repeated some number of times, presumably one section for each item in a list somewhere. Think SharePoint list, right? Got a list of things, and for each item in that list, we want to produce a section in the document, right? Also, we've got the need to conditionally exclude content, right? Based on some expression that says, okay, for this particular version of the document, if this value is not, non-null, or if this value is true, then don't put this clause in there. Don't put these clauses in there, right? So in the search scenario, that would be an ideal place. Let's say we had a placeholder that said, create a repeating section that's going to pull in some number of clauses from some location somewhere, but only if the clause has been selected to be included by the user, right? And so you've got a workflow that's building this, and the workflow stops and lets the user select, using a search query, which components they want to include. They put check marks on the ones. The workflow continues, and then it comes back in here, and this thing pulls in the result of that expression evaluation and then creates the repeating sections, right? So this structure, if we can get this to work, we can then leverage that in many different kinds of document assembly scenarios that will actually produce documents that people are willing to accept, right? They're not just toy documents, they're real documents, okay? So, what's our solution strategy? We want to start again with a schema, okay? Why do we do that? Well, I mentioned InfoPath. I actually built a solution using InfoPath where I define the schema, gave it to InfoPath. InfoPath gives me the data. I give the data to my document generation engine, and everybody's happy, okay? It allows the user to just create the content that they want in a nice form. And I know for a fact that it's going to work because I've defined my document assembly engine around the fact that it can be given a schema. We also need to transform that schema into an object model so we can do serialization and deserialization easily, and we can also extend the object model to understand the OpenXML SDK, right? So you'll see an example of that too. Create our document template in Word, pull data from the object model into the template, and then we have a nice test platform we can also use to just push sample data out to see if it works. And then we've got an API now that we can call. It's a schematized API that we can call from anywhere. We can put it on the SharePoint server, we can put it on a console app. It doesn't matter. It's always going to work the same way, right? And we can come in later. We can manipulate the data differently without touching the template. We can say, okay, we want to move the data to a database. No problem. We just go into our API. We just pull the data from somewhere else. It follows the same schema, same structure. It's still going to work, okay? So here's what it looks like, sort of laid out pictorially, right? XSD defines our data types and structure, right? We use some sort of tool. I use XSD to code. Do you know about that one? Right? It's on Codeplex. XSD2, the number 2, code. It's a pretty useful plugin. I'll show you how it works in Visual Studio. You just open up the XSD, it generates your code, and it does a better job than the XSD.exe version that Microsoft gives you, right? Has more options and things like that. But I use that to create my POCO objects, and then from that, I use it to serialize and deserialize my XML. In Word, we use content controls in a certain disciplined way in order to define our placeholders. And in those content controls, we place XPath expressions, okay? Those XPath expressions are driven by the schema, right? Because we know where in that structure to find the content that we need. XPath has a rich enough, expressible, it gives us enough expression power to deal with hierarchies, to deal with different data types, right? We can control pretty much everything that we need. We can get everything that we need to construct the document just using XPath, right? This is an Eric White innovation that I've enhanced a little bit. But I've found that it's performant, it satisfies the other requirements, it's easy to understand, the code is fairly straightforward, and it's very flexible in terms of being able to work with these kinds of documents. Okay. A little bit more strategy, right, before we get going. We want to make sure that we handle all data manipulation in the API and not in the template, right? I did experiment with actually putting code in the template, right? This is a holdover from my history, right, where I was sort of convinced that, there was going to be this army of document programmers, right, that would write code and embed them directly into Word. I actually put C# into the content controls. Right? Not a good idea, okay? Right? It worked, it was fun, but no, it's not a good idea, right? So we definitely want to maintain that layering, right? Put all your data manipulation in your API and all styling and layout in the template, right? So don't try to write styles from the OpenXML SDK, even though it provides the ability to do that, right? Put all the styling in the template. Otherwise, you're going to end up writing the old style code, right? And then with that key innovation of using XPath to pull the data. Okay, so there's some basic processing that we're going to do. It's always going to be using a content control, but we're going to use content controls in a slightly different way than you might be used to, right? So we're going to use rich text content controls, first of all, not plain text ones, not image, not table, right? We're going to use the rich text content control in all instances. Why? Well, because it gives us rich text and it's easy to replace, okay? It's easy to find. All those things are consistent, right? We don't have to deal with any different variants of the content control. There are two components of a content control that we can work with. One is the title, the other is the tag. We're going to be using the tag, right, to put some special strings in there. The title is really only useful in developer mode in Word, so that you can find the placeholders, right? The title is going to be used primarily by the template designer. And we're now getting into this mode, right? We're using terminology that should be familiar. It's kind of like, we have web designers and we have content owners, right? It's similar. So we've got a browser that's owning the presentation, and we've got something that's pushing content in there, right? It's like a jQuery thing almost, right? So it's just we've got to put enough properties on the content control. It's kind of like a div, okay? And we're adding some properties to it. And the main property we're putting there is the identifier, the tag, okay? So it's easy to find in the document, easy to substitute for the generated content. It can be nested with other controls, which is the key piece. If we couldn't nest content controls, this wouldn't work at all, okay? And you'll see why. And the tag fields allow us to define our custom processing. There is a limit to the number of characters that you can put there. So this keeps us from putting long expressions in the tag, right? Processing instructions that are really long, right? I ran into that when I was trying to put regular expressions I tried, and C# I tried, all those things, you run out of room and you just can't do arbitrarily complex expressions, okay? So where do you think we would put these things? Because, you know, XPath expressions they can be long, right? Where are we going to put it? In the document, okay? You're going to put it in the document. So you're going to create a content control. Content control sits there, and inside that content control is the actual content, right? We're going to put an XPath expression there, okay? So we're actually coding the document a little bit with XPath, but only with XPath, right? And we're sandwiching it inside of a content control that says what type of content control it is, okay? And you'll see an example of that. I'm just going to go through these different types of controls. So the next thing we have is we have that simple text, right, which kind of appears in the flow of the text of the document. So, you know, company name, first name, last name, contact information, right, sprinkled throughout the document. Could be in the header, in the footer, wherever, right? It's just a text substitution. But then we've got tables and repeating sections, as I mentioned before, right? The tables have this specific structure. The challenge there is that we don't want to, we need to preserve the styling of the table, right? You know, in Word, you can create very fancy tables. Right? You've got all kinds of design elements there. And you know, there's branding and things like that you've got to be concerned about. So you need to be able to somehow tell your engine that this is the layout for the table that I want, right? Here's an example of what each row looks like, okay? And then you've got to also be able to tell it where to go to get the data for the rows and how to lay out the cells. All that information has to be in the template. Similarly for repeating sections, except that you're going to have simple text and tables and maybe other repeating sections inside of the repeating section. So the repeating section itself is going to be inside of a content control. And in that content control, you're going to have other content controls that tell you how to manage the repeating section, each one using XPath expressions. Okay? You with me? Yes? Okay. So the table content control has two nested content controls. Okay? And when I say it's a table content control, I don't mean it's a Word table content control. It's a rich text content control that we're calling a table by virtue of the tag. Right? We're going to put in the tag, this is a table. Right? So that when we process this template, we can find that tag and recognize it. Right? If it's not one of our predefined tags, we're going to just ignore it. But if it's a recognizable tag, one of the ones that we're defining, we're going to say, okay, that's a table. That means that inside that content control, I'm going to find two more content controls, only two. One that defines the data source, that tells me where to get the table data, and one that defines the layout that's going to have the actual table example in it, right? So it's a content control with two other content controls. This other content control is just going to say a tag, tell me, it's going to be another predefined tag that says this is the data source, and the other one's going to say this is a table, right? So now our processing engine can get the data source content type, get the text out of the content type, evaluate the XPath expression, go get the data, then look in for the template, right? The table template, go inside of that content control, get the table, manipulate it, and produce the actual table by merging the data in, right? It's pretty sweet the way it works, okay? Similarly for repeating sections, two content controls, one that defines the data source and one that defines the content template. Not a table, but it tells me the content that I'm going to have to repeat once for each item in the data source, right? And then finally, there's another one that I'll show you an example of when I get into the code for dealing with conditional sections. So I'm going to start browsing this code, right? This one produces a statement of work, okay? The statement of work I chose just because they are complex documents, but they're documents that we typically we understand. I'm going to look at the template first, right? Just open it in Word. It's again being done as an embedded resource inside of the solution, but it's a statement of work template, and you can see how I'm. I think I'll go into design mode, right? And you can see examples of what I was talking about. Okay, here's a content control, and inside of it, actually a part of the document is an XPath expression. Just go to the root of the structure and give me the title. Okay, but you can see that all of these have, select value, right? That's an operation that says go and select the value, which is referenced by this /title expression. Okay. Here I'm saying go get me the author. Here I'm saying go get me the client info /company name. Now you can see the power of XPath because I can have a data structure that makes sense to me as a developer. Okay? I've got a structure within a structure. Right? I'm saying inside of this structure there's a client info structure, and in that there's a company name element. Go get it and bring it in here. Right? If I go further down the template, and just look at some additional things, right? The rest of it, even in the header, so here's a footer that says, okay, I want you to put the company name from the client info and the title of the statement of work in the footer, okay? And then I've got a standard table of contents, which will be generated. If I go past the table of contents, right, you can see that I'm constructing my text. SharePoint Architects has prepared the following statement of work, and I'm going to put the title of the project and the company name again. But now I'm getting into the project objectives here. You can see that I've got a table, right? Because this particular statement of work model allows me to define in my XML multiple objectives for this particular project, right? I've got an overall objective that I can put there, but then I've got a table, and you can see that there's the table content control, and then there are two nested content controls, one that says select the rows and use the XPath expression that says find me anything in there that's of type objective and put that text in here, right? And then the content defines the actual table structure, which is, Word just lays this out in a strange way, but you can see that that table matches this, and inside that there's a content and a select rows. The content actually contains a table in Word, right? And in it I've put that I want to get the XPath expression for the description, but I'm using the dot notation because it's not the description of the project, it's the description of the objective. Okay, it's relative to that context. Okay, that means that I can further nest these, right? I can have tables within tables, and the dot notation would still be relative to the object that was being resolved. So it's nice and clean, right? It just flows down in the way that you would expect, and this is something that's approachable by non-technical folks who just understand. You give them the schema, and they can build this template, okay? Or you give them an example of the data, and they can build it, right? And that just goes on, right? So you just go down, and you can construct your document fairly easily this way. Here's another one, services excluded, right? I've got overall exclusion and then individual exclusions. And then I go further down, I've got the title again. You can have calculations, obviously, right? If your XPath expression is pulling things in, right, we can do that in one of two ways. We can try to create some special XPath, right, or we can just add more tag types, right? So calculate the value or calculate the date. We can put in a little bit of formatting because we've got 255 characters in the tag. So one thing I'm starting to experiment with is instead of just saying select value, right, to have some sort of mini language in there that tells me how to format the value or to do some processing on the value, right? Some little expression that says select the value but then do something with it before you give it back to the template, right? Because the processing, again, needs to be in the API, not in the template, but it's a sort of declarative mechanism, right? If you've got standardized formatting and things like that that you want to do, that's kind of where you'd want to put it, okay? So you get the basic idea of how this flows. Here's another section. This is a particular statement of work that's talking about building SharePoint solutions. So in our schema, we have a way to capture information about the solutions, right? How many solutions we're going to build, meaning what WSPs we're going to build, right? And then we're going to select any number of solutions inside that table. You're going to have, and you can see that there's no order placement, right? There's just two content types inside there, and it'll find them. Here's a repeating section where you are getting every solution. Up here, basically the idea here is you're creating a little table of the solutions, and then here you're providing more detail of each solution using a repeating section which is laid out with more information. There, you're just showing the solution title and description. Down here, you're using the title and description, but now you're detailing what the websites are, what the content types are, what the lists are, and all those things in another nested table, right? So playing with this, you start to see that it really starts to feel more and more like laying out an HTML page, right, with divs, okay, and then feeding it with data using jQuery, right? You've got some engine that's going to find the thing and stuff the data in. Questions? Okay, so let's see what it looks like when we look at it in Visual Studio. First of all, let's look at some sample data. So let's see here. First, I'll look at the XSD. I was telling you about that XSD to code class generator. This is what it looks like, right? It's not a runtime tool. It actually opens its own dialog, but it gives you many more options. You can turn on the serialization, turn it off. You've got a lot of options there. It's a pretty powerful tool. It has evolved pretty substantially over the last few years, and so I use it pretty exclusively, right? Chris Sells had written an extended version of XSD, but then he dropped it, so there needed to be something else, and so XSD to code is a good example of something that generates serialization code for your XSD elements. If you look at this XSD, you can see that it's a simple XSD that defines an SOW with a custom schema, right? And it's just a complex type, and you can see that it has client info, solutions, sites, lists, content types, workflows, objectives, title, author, description, all that stuff, and then the client info has first name. You know, it just flows out like that, right? It's a simple data structure done as a schema, right? So I can throw this at InfoPath. InfoPath will then give me a nice way to capture this information, so I could create a little InfoPath form to create my SOWs, punch a button and throw it at this other template, and I'd have my SOW. So one of the things that we can do here is, as you're going to see in this example, is instead of loading it from an XML file, we're going to create it in memory just by extending the model. So, for example, in my SOW, right, I have a little static method that just builds one, okay, right? And so then when we get over to our code, we create, but then we serialize it to XML because we need that in order to do the transformation, right? So I'm building an SOW in memory, serializing it to a string, and then passing that to my worker routine, which is gonna do the actual build, okay? So let's take a look at that worker routine. Here, we're gonna convert it back to an X element so that we can get the XML really easily. We'll use link to XML to do the work when we do our transformation stuff. The other thing that's interesting here is that I added another tag so that I could pull images, okay? Can't really do effective document assembly if you can't pull images, right? So it's not just text, tables, and repeating sections. There's also one for images. So in this example, I just created a solution diagram image. So the idea is that you're going to give the statement of work to a client, and you want to show them a picture kind of what the site will look like before they commit. So now I'm just creating a file name, right? Simple file manipulation, similar to what you've seen before. A few additional files to throw the XML out, and also to do the document. So I'm writing the data out, and just to give you an example of what that looks like here. Oops. Let's see, under test, is it? Where would that go? So here's an example of that generated XML, right? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Just follows the schema. But just for seeing what it does when I run it. And then I'm calling an additional worker function, which is really closer to the OpenXML SDK, right, to build the SAO. So let's go to that routine. Okay, so what we're getting here is the XML project data, which is that schematized XML. And I'm passing the image in just for convenience in this particular example, right? And then a path to write the document out to, and a path to a log file. And so now I'm loading up the template, and I'm getting it just as a byte array, okay? So I'm pulling it from the resource pool, which is the one I just edited that you just looked at. And I'm checking to see if I have an image. If I do, then what I want to do here is I want to write the image file out to a path and then take that path and add it. I'm injecting it into the XML data stream. Okay? I'm saying at the root, right, in this X element, add another element called image, okay? So that when I build, so that my template can just refer to that, right? That way, I didn't have to put the image in the actual schema, right? I could just stuff it into the XML, right? The schema is great for everything else, but the image may or may not be available, so I'll stick it in afterwards, right? In fact, the image in some cases might be generated from other information in the schema, so you can't really put it in the schema because it's dependent on the schema. Nevertheless, I've got an image and it's in the XPath expression schema thing. So now I'm going to call my XPathGenerator code. I'm going to give it a byte array which contains the template. I'm going to give it the XML project data, which is the schematized XML. I'm going to tell it where to put it, and I'm going to have a little logging. I create a little tool to just log errors, okay? So if I go to that method, right? Now we're drilling into some more recognizable stuff. We got to start with a memory stream, right? And we've been given a byte array, which is our document template. So we're going to write that byte array, okay, into our memory stream and open the word processing document just like we did before when we were doing the XSLT transform, right? So now our word processing document is in memory. Now we're using the OpenXML SDK, and now you're going to see a little bit more effort, right? Not only must we process the main document part, we also have to make sure that we process the header and the footer, any custom XML parts that are there, the endnotes, the footnotes, and the comments, right? Because they might also contain placeholders that we need to deal with, okay? But each one of them is just a document part. So we can have a generic routine, this process document part, that always processes them the same way, right? What we have to do is we have to pass the XML data to each time, which is the entire data set, because we're going to be processing XPath expressions against that XML data, right? So we're going to pass the part, the main part, right, which you always have to pass because you might need the main part in order to resolve references between, in order to find the objects, you need to have the actual main document part, but then you also pass the actual part that you're going to do the transformation on, right? That allows this process document part method to find all the pieces that it may need depending on what it encounters when it's processing those items. Once you've processed all the parts, you just save it to the stream and you're done, right? So the work is really being done inside of this process document part, okay? So now you've given the main document part and an OpenXML part and the data and a log, and you've got SDK support, right? So you can get the X document from the part, right? Now you've got link to XML, okay? And you can see that this is an extension method that I've written, right? So to make it easy for me, right? Because it's going to get more and more detailed as we go into there. How do I find the X document, right? I'm just going to get the XML for the part and convert it into an X document object so that I can use link to XML as I'm building up the rest of my stuff, right? And then I create a new root element by transforming that XDoc root, which is the part, the XML for the part that I'm transforming. I'm going to pass the main part again because the transform function is going to need it, just like I was saying before. But I'm going to get the root element and then pass along the XML data in the log, right? So I'm just doing a little bit of pre-processing here. And if I was able to transform that object, then I can replace in the document that transformed element and then tell the part to put it back. All done, okay? This put X document, another extension, right? So there are some tools that you should know about that I'm going to introduce you to right now. In the Solution Explorer, you can see I've got let me just close this out, a folder here for OpenXML. Microsoft put out some tools, this document builder, right, which gives you a bunch of tools. It's called the OpenXML Power Tools. Free download, go out and get them. Because what it does is it simplifies the process of interacting with the different types of document parts, right? And it also simplifies the namespaces. Remember before we were actually putting the strings, the W and all that when we were writing our XML SDK code? You don't have to do that because what this does is that it preloads all those namespaces. It actually increases the performance of your transformation. right? Because you're not resolving the namespace over and over again. You've preloaded it into an object, so this X attribute, X namespace, all that stuff is there, and you can use it repeatedly, and it's using the same actual object. And all of this detail you don't have to really contend with, because you've got tools in this OpenXML Power Tools set to do the building and to do the resolving. I can't really show you effectively because you're sitting so far in the back there, but you're going to be able to get this code anyway, so you can go through it and see how much easier it is just working with the SDK if you use these power tools. There's a couple of more pieces to that, right? You've got power tool utilities here that have these extensions for doing string concatenation and to do other kinds of resolutions, some of which are fairly obscure, but you know, document ordering, all those details that we were dealing with before, we've got some nice extensions that we can use. And then here's some more specific extensions for dealing with the different naming conventions that have been imposed in that word processing ML, right? Now you've got it basically in an object model that's going to be easier for you to consume as developers, right? You don't have to remember the strings because you've got IntelliSense support, right? So you can just open up the part, and the part's going to tell you what the items are, and it's easier to write the code that way. So back to our process document part. This transform function is where the real work happens, right? So now we've factored it down to the point where we're just doing a transformation on a node, and this is where you can see now we've got our different recognizable tags, and if you want to add more tags, you just add more sections to this code and process them accordingly. We've got one thing I didn't show you was a configuration object, which is a useful idea, and that is, since we're putting stuff inside of the content control, right? And so far we've just put XPath in there. Well, what if we put XML in there, right? We could put some XML in there that would configure the processing engine so that when it reads a document template, it could look for a content control. If it's a configuration control, it could suck up all that XML from inside the document, throw away the configuration control, and that would allow you to determine how you're going to process the template, right? So it's a useful idea. I'm not using it here. In fact, there's no code in here, right? I'm just skipping that config element, but it's a useful idea. So now look, you've got the element name of SDT, which is a content control, right? It has a particular structure, it has properties, and it has an alias and attributes, right? And the tag is associated with that property, right? So we can actually get the tag value, extracting it from the SDT component, right? And ignore all other component types. So now we've found our content control, and we've gotten the tag, and we can just do some tests on the tag value. And so now we've got our select image, which is the one I was just telling you about, that I added here so that I could process images. So if our content control has a tag that says select image, we first get the contents of that content control. A little utility method to do that, to determine what that value selector is. So this is the inside part. It's actually in the document. It's going to have the XPath expression that refers to an image, right? So two things. The template designer has told me that this expression refers to an image by saying select image. And then the expression tells me where to go in the XML data stream to find the image. Now, you could use Base64 if you wanted to, right, and embed the image directly there. Or you could do what I did and store just the file name there or the URL for the image, right, and then resolve the image that way. But the challenge right now is for me to figure out where the image is and to go and get the image, right? So The I value here is, in this scenario, the file name of the image, right? And now I need to create an image part in the document. So I have a special routine that does that, okay? That either finds or creates the image part in the main part, which is the whole document, using that image file name. Why did I do that? It's because they may refer to the same image more than once, and I don't want to spin my wheels creating additional images in the document. I only want to refer to the same document. That's a big challenge typically for dealing with Word documents, because remember the fix-ups before that we were talking about with the XSLT transform? Part of the fix-up mechanism is to deal with the fact that you don't want to have the same, every reference to the image create another image in the document, right? You want it to refer to one image, but with different identifiers, different relationships, right? So find or create image part first searches the document for an image that matches that image file name. If it finds it, it returns that image part. Otherwise, it creates the image part that it needs. And in the process, gives me its dimensions and its resolution. So now that I've found the image, reference the file name, right? I can get the paragraph, right, which is the SDD content inside of the content control. And if I find a paragraph, then replace its run with the actual image. A paragraph may be there inside the content type, or it may just be a run by itself. So I have to check to see if it's just a run, in which case I create the picture element and put it in there. And now when I create that picture element, I'm creating it with a given width and resolution, which is what Word expects to see. So the rest of the code flows similarly, right? If I've got select value, that's a simple replacement of text, okay? Again, I'm decoding the SDT, which is the content control, getting the value selector, resolving the XPath expression just using the standard XPath select element, and then replacing it again if there's a paragraph, finding the run inside the paragraph and putting the new value in. But what's nice here is that because I first converted it into an X element, then I can use, link to XML to do my expressions, and it's pretty straightforward. Similarly, for repeating sections, tables, and conditionals, repeating sections are easier than tables, right? You've got two content controls inside, so I got a routine that says go get the content control by its tag, right? And I'm looking for the content and the select repeating data, and then I'm going to get the content control contents, which tells me where in the XPath to find the information, and then I'm doing the repeating data. What's interesting about this one is that it calls the transform mechanism recursively, right? So as I process each piece of content inside of the repeating element, I want it to process any nested items, whether they be images, text, tables, repeating elements, or whatever, right? So it's a pretty efficient way to do that. Tables are a little bit more of a challenge because I've got to extract the prototype, right, and construct a new table. This one I had to learn because first I tried to inject code into the table, and Word is a little finicky about that. So what I found was that you have to actually create a new table, but then using the data from the existing prototype table. So here's the code that actually goes through and does that, but it goes and gets that prototype row using the information in that second content control, and then it creates the new rows by iterating through the prototype row twice. It iterates through the first time to get any other elements that might be there that Word might have thrown into the row, and then it comes the second time and actually picks up the columns in the table and then creates a new column for each one doing the substitution with the new cell data that you're pulling from the XML, from the XPath expression, right? You can see this new cell data is being put in there. So it looks more difficult than it really is because it's so consistent in terms of how it's laid out. The last one I want to show you here before we run it. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes left? Yeah. About? Okay. So the conditional section is one where you're going to have 3 content controls that are nested inside. And those content controls define a test value, the content that's going to be conditional, and a match element that tells you the value that you're going to match it to. So the select text value is the XPath expression. The match is the value that you're going to test it against that you're placing inside the content control. And then you have the content, which is going to be, just like a repeating section, is going to be the content that's going to be either excluded, right, or if it matches, it's going to be included. And again, you need to do the recursive transform to make sure that everything gets processed accordingly. Okay? So the way this looks when you run it is that, let's just open this up again. Right? You remember the data that was there. If we go into our bin folder, there's output. So this is the data that we're processing. Okay? Just a little bit of data that's there. And then when we run it, it's going to load the template, right? Now we're not converting it to XML, right? Why did it go so fast? It's because we're not generating the whole document, right? We don't have to transform the whole thing and transform it back, right? Even though the XML process was pretty fast, this is faster because we're starting out with a Word document and we're looking for content controls. So we're just looking for replacements. We're ignoring everything else. And then we're getting that expression. We've already got the data. It's a very fast process. And as we scroll down, you'll see that it has found the content, dropped it in with the styling intact, right? All the other styles are there. And if we go further down past our table of contents, right, you can see that it's processed the footer and put everything in the right place. The format is laid out okay. We've got our objectives. We've actually got an image that got pulled in here for the product deliverables, okay? All very quickly, right? So we've achieved reasonable speed in our processing of the document. We've achieved a clean separation between the template designer and the data. We've achieved consistency in our data because it's all schematized XML, right? That means we can throw the schema at another group to build an InfoPath form or some other kind of form, a web form, whatever they want, because when we get the data, we know our template's going to understand it. And we don't have to write that XSL, that XPath transformation code anymore because it's there, it works, right? All we have to worry about now is which kinds of tags we're going to want to put in there, okay? If we've defined that we want to have some sort of specialized tag that says instead of select data, it says, execute query, right? And we actually want to put the query in the template. That's another way to do it, right? We can actually put a camel query in there if we wanted to pull SharePoint content and allow the template designer to do that. But that would violate our rule, right, of not putting that data processing code inside of the template. The template really should be only for layout and styling, and we should schematize the query if we want to put the query there, and maybe store the query somewhere in SharePoint or something along those lines, okay? So let me just wrap it up by going back to the slide deck. One way for your, as you're thinking about building this stuff in SharePoint, I wanted to sort of throw out this model, right? Let's say you wanted to do this. One way you could configure SharePoint is to put those templates in a document library, have an assembly job list with a lookup on the template, right? And then have a content type that defines your assembly job and put that builder code in a builder ASPX code behind so that you could easily upload the template, right? Create a new assembly job, right? And the final piece would be, if you're going to have a schema, decouple the schema by putting columns on the assembly job list that hold the data that you're going to merge into your assembly run, right? That's how I would structure a SharePoint-based document assembly system, okay? It's modeled a little bit after the publishing framework, where you have page layouts and columns on the page layout that allow you to enter data that gets merged with the page, right, when the page is published. Same idea. You have an assembly job with columns, right? You could have different kinds of content types for different schemas, right? And you could even attach the schema to the content type, because the content type has a payload, right? So you could grab the schema from that, you could take it up another notch and spin out the controls based on what's in the schema, and then have a nice, tidy little document assembly engine that you could then deploy. Okay? Questions?